In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Welcome to the Missing Dots tonight. We open a file that many fear to even touch. A story buried under 14 centuries of reverence, controversy, silence, and unanswered questions. Who was Imam Malik ibn Anas? Why did his teachings evolve into a separate sect? Did he unite Islam or divide it? And what truths have been hidden behind the walls of tradition, power, and history? Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about Islamic sects, critical thinking, and the legacy of one of Islam's most influential jurists.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get into this.
Yeah, I'm thrilled you're here. Because, if you look at Islamic history from the outside, or honestly, even if you grew up within the faith, it can sometimes feel like you're wandering through this endless, intimidating maze.
Oh, absolutely. It's overwhelming.
Right. You have all these completely unfamiliar names. You have centuries of incredibly complex legal debates, dynastic politics, wars, shifting borders. It's so easy to just get completely lost in the sheer abstraction of it all.
Yeah, you read a textbook and it just feels cold, distant.
Exactly. But what we're looking at today, when you strip away the centuries of institutional weight and all the academic jargon, is this incredibly human story. It's a story of one man literally just sitting in his hometown trying to hold a rapidly expanding, totally chaotic world together.
And, well, that framing is really the only way to do this subject justice. For our analysis today, we're pulling from a rather massive stack of sources.
Yeah, we really are.
We have classical theological texts, we have historical records stretching all the way back to the 8th century, and we're heavily utilizing modern academic research, too.
But we're not just looking at the flattering stuff, right?
No, not at all. We are looking directly at some of the harshest criticisms leveled by secular historians, modern skeptics, ex-Muslims, and even rival Islamic groups throughout history.
Because our mission here is really to separate the man from the myth.
Right. We need to figure out how a scholar who basically never left his hometown of Medina ended up shaping the daily, intimate lives of, well, hundreds of millions of people today.
And to do that properly, we have to directly address the most uncomfortable controversies surrounding his legacy.
We do. There's really no way around it.
Honestly, we should probably just tackle the most explosive question from our opening right now.
What's it?
The accusation that Imam Malik fragmented a unified religion, that he is somehow responsible for creating his own sect and, dividing Muslims.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I hear this a lot, especially in modern critiques online. People look at the different Islamic schools of thought today and they think, well, the Prophet left one unified community and then these guys came along and just broke it.
Right.
It's actually pretty simple to see why someone would think that from a distance,
It is a very common critique. And it usually stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of Islamic history and Arabic terminology. We really have to deconstruct this label of a sect.
Okay, let's break that down for the listener.
So in Arabic, the word for a sect is firqa. A sect implies a profound division over core theological beliefs.
Like the actual foundations of the faith.
Exactly. It means disagreeing on the nature of God or who is a legitimate prophet, or the fundamental articles of faith. If you look at the Sunni-Shia split, for example, which began immediately after the Prophet Muhammad's death in 632 CE.
Right, over succession.
Yeah, that was initially a massive political fracture over succession, but over decades it evolved into a distinct theological split. Or look at the Kurdites, who broke away around 657 CE.
They were pretty intense.
Very. They splintered over intense political and theological extremism. They basically declared that other Muslims who committed major sins were suddenly unbelievers and could be fought.
Wow. Okay, so those are actual sects.
Right, those are sects. They alter the foundational identity of the faith.
So a sect is disagreeing on the actual foundational identity, like the DNA of the religion itself.
Yes, exactly. But Imam Malik did not found a firqa. He is the figurehead of a madhab, which translates to a school of jurisprudence.
A school of jurisprudence, okay.
It's a legal methodology. All four of the major Sunni madhabs, so that's Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, they all share the exact same core theological DNA.
So they aren't arguing about the big stuff.
No, they're not disagreeing on who God is or the validity of the Quran. They are disagreeing on the methodology of how to extract practical, everyday rules from that scripture when dealing with new situations.
I never thought about it that way. It's almost like confusing a debate over constitutional law with an actual civil war where a state tries to violently secede from the country.
That is a beautiful analogy.
They are completely different categories of human disagreement.
That captures it perfectly. And if we look at the historical timeline, the accusation that Malik was a divider just falls apart completely.
Yeah, the timeline really matters here for anyone listening.
It really does. Imam Malik was born around 711 CE. By the time he was a functioning scholar, sitting in the mosque teaching, the major theological and political divisions, the actual sects we just talked about, they had already existed and been fighting for almost a century.
Right, the Umayyad dynasty was falling, the Abbasid revolution was brewing.
Exactly. The fragmentation had already happened. And furthermore, even within the realm of legal schools, he wasn't the first to develop a distinct methodology.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Abu Hanifa, who founded the Hanafi school in Iraq, preceded him. The emergence of these legal schools was not an act of rebellion. It was an organic, desperate necessity.
Because the empire was just getting too big.
Right. The empire is expanding far faster than its legal framework could handle.
So instead of carving up a perfect block of unity, they were actually trying to build structures to manage the complexity of an empire that suddenly stretched from Spain to India.
That's exactly it.
But the sources also point out this concept of ikhtilaf, right?
Yeah.
Scholarly disagreement.
Yes, ikhtilaf. In classical Islamic thought, disagreement among qualified scholars on secondary legal matters wasn't seen as a weakness. It wasn't a flaw in the system.
What was it seen as then?
It was viewed as a mercy, a rahmah. We have clear historical records showing that even the Prophet Muhammad's own closest companions disagreed on legal rulings after his death.
Wait, really? The companions themselves?
Oh, absolutely. They argued over inheritance calculations or how to handle conquered lands in Iraq. Having different legal methodologies provided the global community with the flexibility to adapt to wildly different regions, cultures, and eras without breaking the core theology.
The thing is, I hear that. But if you're listening to this and thinking critically, you have to push back a little here.
Sure, go ahead.
If all these scholars are following the exact same Quran and the exact same Sunnah, the recorded traditions of the Prophet, why not just sit down in a room and hammer out one definitive rulebook?
It's a fair question.
Doesn't having 4 different schools make the religion look man-made or, I don't know, inconsistent? Like, if it's a divine law, why leave room for disagreement at all?
That is the ultimate question skeptics and secular historians raise. But it assumes the scripture is meant to function like a modern tax code.
Right.
And we really have to understand what the Quran and the Sunnah actually are. They provide foundational principles, profound ethical boundaries, and some very specific laws regarding things like prayer or inheritance.
Not everything.
No, they do not provide an exhaustive, itemized legal manual for every single scenario that will ever happen until the end of time.
Because if it did, the book would be 1,000,000 pages long and completely irrelevant to someone living in the 8th century, right?
Correct. I mean, when the Islamic Empire suddenly absorbs the incredibly complex agricultural societies in Egypt,
Right.
or inherits the sophisticated maritime commerce of the Mediterranean, or encounters entirely new financial instruments in Persia, you can't just flip to an index in the Quran and find a verse about maritime insurance liability.
Yeah, that just doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. So you need a rigorous, consistent intellectual methodology to extract a ruling from the original 7th century principles that legitimately applies to this new 8th century reality.
Okay, I see.
The 4 schools are just 4 different, highly rigorous methodologies for bridging that gap.
Okay, that makes complete sense. The law has to breathe. And to understand how Imam Malik built his specific methodology to make the law breathe, the sources make it very clear we have to look at where he lived.
Yes.
The environment completely shaped the man.
You cannot separate Imam Malik from the physical and spiritual city of Medina. It is the defining feature of his entire worldview.
So let's dig into his life. He's born around 711 CE to a family of Yemeni origin, though they were deeply established in Medina by then.
Right.
And he spent his entire life in the Prophet's city. He basically never left, except to make the mandatory pilgrimage to Mecca. He sat in the Prophet's mosque, and he studied under these massive intellectual titans. Men like Nafi, who was the freed slave of Abdullah ibn Umar, one of the most prominent companions of the Prophet.
A huge figure.
And he studied with Jafar al-Sadiq, a towering figure in both Sunni and Shia history. And when you read the historical accounts of Malik, they just, I don't know, they just glow. Mashallah, he was known for incredible piety.
Oh, the stories about his respect for the tradition are amazing.
He would wear his finest clothes and perfume himself just to sit and teach the hadith out of respect. He had this intense, deep reverence for his teachers, the texts, and literally the soil of the city itself.
Yeah, and his reverence for Medina goes far beyond just, civic pride. It is the epistemological foundation of his legal philosophy.
Okay, big word there.
Well, this brings us to the absolute core concept of the Maliki worldview, Amal al-Madina, which translates to the practice of the people of Medina.
If you're listening, pay attention to this, because this seems to be the dividing line between him and every other scholar of his era.
It is the great differentiator. Let's look at the contrast. Scholars in places like Iraq, like the Hanafis in Kufa and Baghdad, they were dealing with a cosmopolitan, incredibly diverse, rapidly changing society.
A total melting pot.
Exactly. They were encountering Persian culture, Greek philosophy, complex economics. And because they were far from the original source and facing unprecedented problems, they had to rely heavily on intensive logic, hypothetical scenarios, and rational deduction to solve new problems.
But Malik was sitting in Medina.
Right. The capital had moved to Damascus and then to Baghdad. Medina was relatively quiet. It was the city where the Prophet had lived his last 10 years, where the community was established, and where thousands of his companions had lived and died.
So Malik is looking around and realizing he doesn't need to invent hypothetical logic puzzles.
Exactly. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. He believed that the continuous everyday practice of the people living in Medina, who were the literal children and grandchildren of the Prophet's companions, was the most authentic transmission of Islam on earth.
It was the living sunnah.
Yes, the living sunnah.
So he is basically looking at his window, watching how the descendants of the original community are trading dates in the market, how they're getting married, how they are washing for prayer, and saying, this lived reality is the truest record we have.
And this philosophy culminated in his monumental life's work, a book called The Muwatta. He spent 40 years compiling, editing, and refining it.
40 years. That's dedication.
It is one of the earliest surviving collections of Islamic law and hadith in existence. But we have to understand, it wasn't just a list of quotes. It was a massive, documented survey of what the people of Medina were actually doing.
Right, capturing that living reality.
The title itself, Muwatta, means the well-trodden path, or the smoothed path. The empire was starting to fracture over legal debates, and Malik was trying to document the established consensus of the original city to smooth out these growing differences.
Okay, I'm reading through these academic critiques, and I have to stop you here.
Uh-oh.
The thing is, what you just described sounds incredibly risky from a theological standpoint. You're saying that if a single, highly authenticated hadith, like a written or orally transmitted quote from the Prophet, said one thing, but the people of Medina were collectively doing something slightly different, Malik would actually override the written text and go with the people.
Yeah.
Isn't that elevating human custom over a divine text? Modern critics, especially from more literalist, text-heavy schools of thought, they jump all over this as a fatal flaw.
It is easily the most common critique of his methodology, both historically and today. But the logic behind Malik's choice is actually deeply mathematical and epistemological.
Mathematical.
Yeah. It is not about favoring humans over God. It relies on the crucial difference between tawatur and ahad modes of transmission.
If you're taking notes, those are the key terms. Break them down for us.
An ahad report is a solitary or limited transmission. Imagine one person heard the Prophet say something, they remembered it. They told one person a decade later, who later told one person.
Like a game of telephone.
Exactly. Even if every single person in that chain is thoroughly investigated and deemed highly trustworthy, human error is still possible. Someone might have walked into the room late and missed the context of the quote. Someone might have forgotten an exception to the rule.
Right.
Tawatur, on the other hand, is mass transmission.
Like thousands of people doing the exact same thing simultaneously, generation after generation.
Yes. And that points to something even deeper about how knowledge survives. Malik argued that if thousands of people in Medina are collectively practicing a specific tradition over generations, it is logically and mathematically impossible for them to have all colluded to invent it.
Or for all of them to have simultaneously misunderstood it.
Exactly. That collective, continuous physical action is a stronger, more certain proof of what the Prophet actually intended than a single isolated quote transmitted by one guy.
Wow.
He wasn't elevating human custom over divine text at all. He was arguing that mass communal practice is the most reliable, uncorrupted transmission of the Prophet's instruction.
You know, let me try to use an analogy here because I think this is just brilliant.
Go for it.
Imagine you have a handwritten recipe card from your great-grandmother for this incredibly complex specific soup.
Okay, I like soup.
That recipe card is the Ahad report, the solitary text. But let's say there's an entire village in the old country where every single family has been cooking that exact same soup together every single day for 3 generations.
Right.
Now, if the recipe card says add 1 tablespoon of salt, but the entire village, without exception, uses 1 teaspoon, Malik is saying trust the village.
Yes.
Because the person who wrote the card might have made a typo or meant a different type of spoon or just missed a step. But an entire community doesn't accidentally change the recipe if they've been eating it daily for 80 years.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the epistemology. For Imam Malik, Medina was that village. It was the crucible where the religion was formed. Its daily rhythm was the ultimate proof of authenticity. Why rely on a solitary rumor of a text when you can watch the living descendants enact the truth?
So because Malik prioritized this living reality, his legal framework had to develop unique tools to handle real-world, everyday problems. It could just be purely theoretical logic games.
No, not at all. And this leads us to the structural brilliance of the Maliki blueprint. We've established his hierarchy of sources, and it's important to state them clearly.
Okay, what's the hierarchy?
So, the absolute first source is the Quran. Then comes the mass-transmitted Sunnah and the Medinan practice. Then comes consensus of the scholars, and finally analogy or qiyas, where you compare a new problem to an old one.
Makes sense.
But where the Maliki school gets truly fascinating, and where it differs significantly from others in its breadth, is its use of a concept called maslaha mursala.
Which means public interest.
Yes, unrestricted public interest. The Maliki school allows for legal rulings to be made purely based on what is best for the public welfare, provided that the ruling doesn't directly contradict a clear text from the Quran or the Sunnah.
It's actually pretty simple when you think about it. While other legal schools might be strictly looking at the text, sweating over definitions, or trying to find a clever, logical loophole, the Maliki approach is stepping back, looking at the city and asking, what is the actual benefit to society here?
Let's take that a step further and look at a concrete historical example from criminal law, which the sources highlight.
Okay, let's hear it.
Islamic law, derived from the Quran, has strict, specific punishments for theft. But Maliki jurists historically adapted the threshold of what constitutes a punishable theft based on macroeconomic conditions.
Wait, really? Like inflation?
Like famine. During times of severe famine, drought, or extreme poverty, they utilized the concept of maslaha mursala to protect the vulnerable. They essentially argued that enforcing the strictest literal punishment when people are literally starving to death contradicts the higher ethical objectives of the law.
Oh, wow.
You cannot cut off the hand of a man stealing bread to feed his dying child because the public interest demands the preservation of life over the protection of property in that specific moment.
That is fascinating. The law bends so the society doesn't break. It makes me think of modern emergency powers, or how a judge today might give a lighter sentence based on extenuating societal circumstances.
You see that exact bending in their commerce laws as well. As trade routes exploded across North Africa and the Sahara, merchants were inventing entirely new types of business contracts, partnerships, and delayed payment systems that simply didn't exist in 7th century Arabia.
Right, the economy was evolving.
Exactly. Strict literalists might say, we have no textual precedent for this contract, therefore it is forbidden. But Maliki jurists validated these new economic vehicles based on maslaha mursala public benefit.
Because they knew people needed to trade.
Right. They realized that if they outlawed these contracts, the economy of North Africa would grind to a halt. So as long as there was no explicit exploitation, monopoly, or usury involved, the public interest made the contracts legally valid.
And the sources also highlight another massive tool in their kit, IRF, or local custom.
IRF is absolutely crucial for understanding how this school eventually conquered half the known world. The Maliki school explicitly accepts local cultural practices as legally valid, again, as long as they don't violate core Islamic principles.
Okay, but if you are a skeptic or a historian looking at this from a rival sect's perspective, you look at public interest and local custom, and you ask, what relaxations did Malik invent just to attract followers?
Yeah, that's the accusation.
They accuse him of watering down the religion, making it easy and pliable just to win a popularity contest.
It is a cynical view, but a very prevalent one in academic critiques. The defense against this, which is well documented, is that Malik didn't invent relaxations. He wasn't a populist.
So what was he doing?
He utilized istisla, the seeking of public benefit, and heavily relied on maqasid, the higher objectives of the law.
The objectives.
Yes. The scholars identified that the entire purpose of Islamic law is to preserve 5 core things: faith, life, intellect, lineage, and property. If a strict literalist interpretation of a minor secondary rule suddenly threatened one of those 5 core objectives, the Maliki jurist was obligated to pivot to public interest.
Oh, I see.
It wasn't about making things easy just so people would like him. It was about ensuring the law remained practical, just, and aligned with the overarching ethics of the religion. Moderation prevents strictness, and strictness is what causes societies to collapse under unworkable, suffocating rules.
It is a highly pragmatic, almost sociological approach to law. But, you can't be this influential and this fiercely independent in your thinking without making serious enemies or facing intense pressure.
Oh, certainly not.
When you read the biography, Malik's approach put him on a direct collision course with both his intellectual rivals and the most powerful government on earth.
He was navigating an incredibly volatile intellectual and political landscape. The 8th century was not a quiet time.
Let's look at the intellectual rivals first.
There were fierce debates. He clashed significantly with the Hanafis of Iraq. Malik felt they relied way too heavily on pure human reason, which they called Ray, instead of grounding themselves in transmitted texts and practices.
He thought they were getting too theoretical.
Yes, he felt they were inventing answers to problems that hadn't even happened yet.
Right, the classic tradition versus reason debate. And interestingly, his own most famous student, al-Shafi'i, ended up leaving Medina and eventually forming his own school because he wanted to find a systematic middle ground between Malik's heavy focus on Medinan practice and the Iraqi focus on abstract reason.
That intellectual friction birthed genius. But the clashes weren't just about how to wash for prayer or sign a contract. They were about the very nature of God.
Oh, wow.
And this is where we have to address a major critique from secular and atheist historians regarding Malik's hostility toward rationalist theologians, specifically groups like the Mutazilites.
The sources show Malik absolutely hated kalam, which is speculative philosophical theology. It's basically mixing Greek philosophy with Islamic theology.
Yes, he was not a fan.
He famously said that seeking religion through kalam leads straight to heresy. Now, secular critics point to this and say, look, here's the proof. He was anti-rationality, anti-philosophy, and he wanted to shut down critical thought.
It is very easy to view it that way through a modern secular lens that prizes philosophy above all else. But we really have to understand why he hated kalam.
Why was he so against it?
Malik was a pragmatist to his bones. He looked at these theologians in Iraq sitting in circles, debating abstract, completely unanswerable philosophical questions. They were arguing over the exact atomic essence of God, or the microscopic mechanics of free will versus predestination, or whether the Quran was created or uncreated.
Things that don't really affect daily life.
Exactly. Malik saw this as dangerous, arrogant speculation that violently divided the community and had absolutely zero practical benefit for the single mother trying to feed her kids or the merchant trying to trade fairly.
He wanted to focus on how to live, not how to philosophize about the unknowable.
You can see that directly in the historical record. He preferred practical law over abstract debate. He believed the core theology of Islam was clearly established, simple, and accessible to everyone.
So overcomplicating it was the issue.
Yes. Endlessly picking it apart with imported Greek-style logic was an innovation that distracted from the actual physical practice of the faith. It wasn't that he hated human reason. He hated reason being applied to the divine essence, an area where he felt the human brain was fundamentally ill-equipped and bound to fail.
Okay, so he clashed with theologians, but his clash with the state was much more visceral and much more dangerous. The sources detail a really dramatic moment involving the Abbasid Caliph, al-Mansur.
This is a defining moment in his biography, and it thoroughly debunks another major secular critique.
Set the stage for us.
To set the stage. The Abbasid revolution had just violently overthrown the Umayyad dynasty. The new caliph, al-Mansur, was deeply paranoid about rebellion.
As you would be after a revolution.
Right. He demanded that everyone in the empire swear a binding oath of allegiance to him. And to make sure nobody broke it, he decreed that anyone who broke this political oath would automatically have their wives divorced from them, their slaves freed, and their property confiscated.
That's insane.
It was a brutal, totalitarian way of using family and property law as political blackmail.
And Malik, sitting in Medina, refused to play along.
He issued a public fatwa, a legal ruling stating clearly that an oath made under coercion or threat is completely invalid in the eyes of God and the law. Therefore, the caliph's forced divorces were null and void.
Think about what that means for a second. He basically told the most powerful monarch on the planet, a man who had just won a bloody revolution, that his primary political tool of control was illegal.
And he paid a horrific price for it. The governor of Medina had Malik dragged out and publicly flogged for this defiance. SubhanAllah, the accounts say he was beaten so severely that his shoulder was dislocated and he had to carry his arm in a sling for the rest of his life.
I want to pause here. Some secular historians try to argue that these early legal schools were just tools of state control, manufactured by the elites to keep the uneducated masses in line.
I've read those arguments.
But if the state is literally torturing the founder of the school in the public square, that narrative falls completely apart, right?
It completely demolishes that cynical narrative.
Yeah.
The flogging proved Imam Malik's absolute independence. He prioritized the integrity of the law and the protection of the people over his own safety.
He didn't back down.
No. He could have easily found a legal loophole for the caliph, but he refused. And the most remarkable part of this entire saga is what happened years later.
Because the caliph eventually realized he made a huge mistake and tried to make amends, right?
Yes. Al-Mansur, and later the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, recognized Malik's immense popularity and towering intellect. They tried to institutionalize his work.
How so?
They met with Malik and offered to take his book, the Muwatta, and make it the official mandatory constitution of the entire Abbasid Empire. They wanted to hang a copy inside the Kaaba in Mecca and force every single judge from Egypt to Persia to rule exclusively by his text.
Which, let's be honest, would be the ultimate dream for almost any human being. Unimaginable power, influence, and a guarantee that your legacy will dominate the globe.
But Malik refused. He actively refused to let the state impose uniformity.
Why?
He argued to the caliph that the companions of the prophet had dispersed across the world decades ago, settling in places like Iraq, Syria, and Egypt. They had taken valid, authentic traditions with them that the people of Medina might not have.
So he acknowledged he didn't have the full picture.
Exactly. He told the caliph that it would be unjust and intellectually dishonest to force his specific Medinan perspective on regions that had developed their own valid, historically rooted practices. He chose pluralism and intellectual humility over absolute tyrannical power.
That is just incredible. He literally rejected the opportunity to have a global monopoly on the law. But here is the massive historical paradox that I need you to explain.
What's that?
If he explicitly refused to let the caliph impose his school globally, and he himself basically never left his neighborhood in Medina, how on earth did Maliki law become the absolute dominant force in North Africa, West Africa, and Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus?
It is one of the most fascinating expansions of ideas in history. It wasn't spread by the sword, and it wasn't spread by an imperial decree from Baghdad. It happened entirely organically, through a massive decentralized student network.
The Hajj played a huge role here, didn't it? The pilgrimage.
The Hajj was the ultimate ancient networking event. Every year, Muslims from the furthest edges of the empire traveled to the Arabian Peninsula. And while they were there, thousands of the brightest minds traveled up to Medina specifically to study with the great Imam Malik.
So people were coming to him.
Exactly. They sat in his circles in the mosque, they memorized his rulings, they meticulously copied the Muwatta by hand, and then they packed up their camels and took those teachings thousands of miles back to their home countries.
The sources mention specific students who were instrumental in this, like a man named Sanun.
Sanun is a monumental figure in this story. He was a scholar from Kairouan, which is in modern-day Tunisia. Where Iran was becoming a massive intellectual hub. Sanun compiled a massive text called the Mudawwana. It was basically an extensive, highly detailed Q&A recording Imam Malik's rulings as transmitted through another major student, Ibn al-Qasim.
So it was like a masterclass transcript.
Yes. The Mudawwana became the absolute foundational text for the entire region. It systematized the school, making it incredibly accessible for judges and students across North Africa.
But if you're local in Tunisia or Spain, why adopt it so readily? There were other schools available. The Hanafis were around. Why did this specific Medinan methodology catch fire in the West?
It goes right back to that concept we discussed earlier, urf, or local custom.
Oh, right. Because the Maliki school had a built-in mechanism to accept local customs as legally valid. The indigenous populations, like the Berber tribes in the Atlas Mountains or the local European populations in Andalusia, didn't have to completely erase their own cultures to be considered good Muslims.
It was the perfect organic fit. If a more rigid, purely text-based school had arrived, it would have demanded the wholesale abandonment of indigenous traditions, leading to cultural friction and rebellion.
That makes total sense.
The Maliki school allowed for cultural synthesis. It essentially said, keep your local dress, keep your agricultural customs, keep your societal structures, as long as the core tenets of monotheism and basic Islamic ethics are preserved. This made the religion feel indigenous, rather than like a foreign imperial imposition.
That explains the grassroots spread. But state patronage did eventually play a role in cementing it, didn't it?
Yes, politics eventually caught up. While it started as a grassroots movement, later dynasties recognized the incredible stabilizing and unifying power of the Maliki framework.
Give us an example.
Take the Umayyads in Spain. They were the bitter rivals of the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. By officially adopting the Maliki school, the Umayyads in Cordoba gave themselves a distinct religious and legal identity completely separate from their enemies in the east.
Oh, so it was a political statement, too.
Exactly. Later, you have the Almoravid dynasty, a powerful, austere Berber empire that ruled vast swaths of North Africa and Spain. They actively promoted Maliki jurisprudence to unify their wildly diverse territories and to counter the political influence of rival groups like the Kharijites and the Shia Fatimids in Egypt.
If you're listening to this, just think about how wild this butterfly effect is. A quiet scholar sitting in Medina observing the daily habits of his neighbors creates a philosophical framework.
Yeah, it's wild to think about.
And centuries later, that exact framework is governing trade routes across the Sahara Desert, dictating the high court rulings in the palaces of Islamic Spain, and unifying Berber tribes purely because his students took meticulous notes and his system was adaptable enough to absorb the world.
It is the ultimate testament to the durability of a methodology based on human reality rather than pure abstraction, which naturally brings us to the modern era and the legacy of the school today.
Yeah, let's bring it to the present.
We have to look at its impact in the modern world and address the most aggressive contemporary critiques regarding science, apostasy, and critical thought.
Let's start with the loudest critique. There is this pervasive myth that Imam Malik and the traditional schools closed the doors of ijtihad.
Ah, yes, ijtihad being independent, critical, legal reasoning.
Right. There's a popular historical narrative that early Islam was this vibrant, scientifically advanced, free-thinking utopia, but then these rigid legal schools calcified everything, shut down free thought, and plunged the Islamic world into a dark age.
It is a very persistent narrative, often pushed by both secular reformers and modern puritanical movements, but the historical record debunks it entirely. The Maliki school constantly adapted.
So they didn't close the doors.
They did not close the doors of critical thinking. They simply established rigorous, professional parameters for it, much like how modern science requires the scientific method rather than just guessing. And within those parameters, the Maliki world produced some of the most massive polymaths and groundbreaking free thinkers in human history.
I love this part. Walk us through some of these minds.
Let's look at Ibn Khaldun, born in Tunis in the 14th century. He was a devout, practicing Maliki judge. Today, he is universally recognized by modern academics as the founding father of sociology, historiography, and demography.
That's huge.
His monumental book, the Muqaddimah, revolutionized how human beings understand the rise and fall of civilizations, tribalism, and economics. Or look at Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes.
Averroes, right.
He was literally the chief Maliki judge of Cordoba in Andalusia, and simultaneously, he was arguably the greatest Aristotelian philosopher of the Middle Ages. His commentaries on Aristotle profoundly shaped the European Renaissance and the Enlightenment.
That's incredible.
Or Al-Idrisi, the great geographer who mapped the known world for the Norman king of Sicily. These men were not suppressed by Maliki jurisprudence. They were the direct products of its intellectual environment.
But how? How did a legal framework based on the traditions of 8th century Medina foster sociology and Greek philosophy?
Because of its pragmatism. By heavily focusing the religious law on practical, observable human action and societal welfare maslaha, and by discouraging wild theological speculation, pelham, the Maliki framework effectively allowed empirical science and philosophy to operate in their own lanes.
Oh, I see. They separated the practical law from the scientific observation.
Yes. Ibn Rushd could dissect Aristotelian logic, and Ibn Khaldun could observe the brutal realities of political cycles without constantly worrying they were violating some abstract, hyper-rigid theological dogma. The law was about how to live justly. The observation of the universe was left to the intellect.
It's amazing that critics try to box this school in as rigid or anti-science, when historically, the Maliki courts in places like Spain and Morocco were the ones legally underwriting and funding massive hospitals, medical research, and astronomical observatories through the WAC system, the charitable endowments.
And even if we look at modern metrics, which our sources tackle directly, we see the echoes of this intellectual tradition. Skeptics often ask, very bluntly, well, if this system is so great, how many Nobel Prizes have Malikis won?
Right, it's a provocative question.
But in 2023, Mamji Bawendi won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. He is of Tunisian heritage, a historically and culturally deeply Maliki region. Now, we have to be intellectually honest. The overall number of Muslim Nobel laureates in the hard sciences is historically low due to a massive web of complex geopolitical, colonial, and economic factors over the last 2 centuries.
Sure, you have to factor in history.
But the Maliki regions are represented. The data simply does not prove an inherent anti-science bias in the jurisprudence itself.
The sources also tackle some really blunt demographic questions, specifically about apostasy. Ex-Muslim critics sometimes argue that the alleged rigidity, strictness, or outdated nature of these traditional schools is driving people away from the religion in droves.
We have to look at the actual demographic data, and it simply doesn't support a madhab-specific exodus. Surveys show that while people do leave the faith and apostasy rates indicate about 82% of ex-Muslims globally come from Sunni backgrounds, this perfectly statistically mirrors the general global population, as Sunnis make up roughly 85% to 90% of all Muslims.
So it's just proportional.
Exactly. People leave religions for a wide variety of doctrinal, personal, political, or human rights reasons, but there is zero empirical data linking apostasy to a specific flaw or rigidity in the Maliki legal methodology.
In fact, the sources point out the exact opposite trend in other regions. Conversions in West Africa actually boomed specifically because of the school's adaptability.
Yes, the expansion in West Africa is a perfect counter-narrative. The Maliki school's organic integration with local Sufi orders like the Tijaniya and the Qadiriya facilitated massive peaceful conversions over centuries.
How did that work?
The deeply spiritual, inward focus of Sufism combined perfectly with the practical, culturally adaptable, outward legal framework of Malikism. It proved to be an incredibly resonant, holistic system for millions of people. Today, as a result of all this history, the Maliki school represents roughly 25% of all Sunni Muslims globally.
Which is, what, around 500 million people?
Mashallah, yes. It is a staggering legacy. It thrives today because it achieves a very delicate, remarkable balance. It balances an intense, unyielding reverence for textual tradition with a deep, pragmatic, empathetic understanding of human needs and societal realities.
That's a great way to put it.
It is, at its core, a conciliatory jurisprudence. It constantly seeks to smooth the path to make life functional and just, precisely as the title of Imam Malik's book, The Muwatta, implies.
So as we wrap up this journey through history, I want to tee up a final thought. We live in an age of absolute digital information overload. Anyone, at any time, can pull up an isolated text, a single translated quote, or an out-of-context statistic online to definitively prove a point or condemn someone else.
Oh, happens every day on social media.
But looking back at Imam Malik, sitting in Medina 1,300 years ago, he realized that wasn't enough.
He realized the danger of the isolated text. Imam Malik's insistence on looking at the living, breathing practice of a community is a profound challenge to how we consume information today.
It really is.
It forces us to ask a difficult question. In our modern world, does a text, a law, or a sacred principle truly mean anything if we ignore how it is actually lived, practiced, and embodied by real people in the messy reality of everyday life?
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.